Cavalcade is a movie that I really don't want to review. Like, I don't even hate it all that much. It's just one of those movies that you watch and after it's over, your general reaction can be summed up in just one word. Meh. Don't love it, don't hate it, just kind of meh. On a scale of to whatever. And I kind of get the sense that that would be most people's reactions to watching it. Not really worth getting angry over, but at the same time, the people who would probably still like this movie in today's world are pretty few and far between. It's the kind of movie that you almost completely forget about as soon as it's over. Like, if you came up to me on the street and asked me what do I think of Cavalcade, well, first I would ask you who you are and why are you asking me random questions on the street, and probably shoo you away because you're most likely a schizophrenic, but then I would also just respond with, meh. But because this won the Oscar for Outstanding Production, that means I actually have to give a review about it. And believe me, when I say that motivating myself to actually give enough of a crap about this movie to do a video review on it was like pulling teeth. Cavalcade begins at the turn of the century in 1899 and revolves around an upper-class British couple called the Marriotts. Jane, played by Diana Wynyard, and Robert, played by Clive Brooke, who are accompanied by their servants, the Bridgeses. The Bridges family. Ellen, played by Una O'Connor, and Alfred, played by Herbert Munden. Robert and Alfred enlist in the army to go fight in the Second Boer War, which, needless to say, puts their wives a little bit on edge. Now, rather than doing something cool like showing us the war and the hell that the husbands go through, the movie spends the bulk of this subplot just focusing on Jane and her constant fear of her husband's well-being, which is only made worse because of the British Empire's constant propaganda about how awesome the war is. Okay, this is interesting. Seeing the grief of a widow offset by the propaganda of the country he could potentially die for does make for some smart commentary, though I'm not gonna lie, her whining does get kind of annoying after a while. The really sad thing is that this is probably the best part of the whole movie. Eventually, the war does end and the husbands do come back. Not in a coffin, or with missing limbs, or even shell-shocked. They just come back. So, in other words, yeah, that commentary of the British propaganda machine, turns out it was totally pointless and Jane just seems like kind of a whiner. But wait, the war is over now. Where does the movie go from here? Well, the Marriotts get to see the funeral procession of Queen Victoria. No big conflicts, it just happens. Then Robert becomes knighted. Again, no big conflicts, it just happens. Then the Bridges family opens up a pub. No big conflicts, it just happens. Are you starting to see the problem with this movie yet? As you have probably figured out by now, Cavalcade basically details the life of these two families, or really just the Marriotts actually, the other family eventually gets phased out in the back half of the movie, over the course of about 30 or so years, interacting with all sorts of historical events that occurred in Britain during that time. An ambitious goal, to be sure, but here's a prime example of why this movie does not work.
Look! Blériot flying the channel. He's done it!
Now what the characters are looking at here is when Louis Blériot became the very first person to fly an airplane over the English Channel in 1909. It was one of the biggest milestones in aviation history, and witnessing it must have been something special. But the problem is that there is no context given for this event. There's no characters talking about whether or not he'll make it, no build-up. Hell, when you watch that clip, did it even seem like that magical or big of a moment? Pretty much every historical event in the movie is like that. The Second Boer War is, like I said, you don't even see it. The death of Queen Victoria doesn't seem to impact anything. Probably the most bizarre example would be this. This newlywed couple spends their honeymoon on a cruise ship and they have this very, very long scene talking about their new life together and how much in love they are. And then it cuts to reveal that the cruise ship they're on is the RMS Titanic. Okay, first off, that reveal is perfect comedic timing. Like, it's funny. Like, it's not tragic, it's legit hilarious. Seriously, just watch this edit. Is it even worth mentioning at this point that you don't even see the Titanic sink and the people die? Or for that matter, the family's reactions to their deaths? Yeah, at the beginning of the movie, they spent a long-ass time developing Jane's reaction just to when someone's in danger. Now that someone's actually dead, they just ignore it. This should be one of the biggest moments in the movie. Where's the payoff? You also don't get much in the sense of these characters developing either. Some of them are okay, I guess, but others will have their personalities completely and totally change on the stop of a dime. Which, okay, yes, that does happen sometimes. People can change over time, but there needs to be some sort of hint that this would happen. For example, at one point in the movie, we find out that Alfred has become a raging alcoholic. Where did that come from? He seemed like a nice guy. You never saw him drink or rely too much on alcohol or come off as maybe a little bit of a jerk one time. Do you know where it came from? It came from the fact that the film realized that it needs some kind of drama in this part of the movie because it's been kind of dull, so they artificially manufactured some rather than making it feel organic. There's not even a point to Cavalcade. The characters don't develop, they don't lead especially interesting lives, and as I mentioned, the historical events aren't given the justice they deserve. The film ends with a scene of an elderly Robert and Jane sharing a toast, talking about the future of Britain and reflecting on their lives in a nostalgic way, in a very cheerful scene. Pretty disturbingly so, I might add. Seriously, what happens to these two at the end of the movie is a pretty awful fate. It's something that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, and they seem to take it in stride. This is how psychopaths react to the film's events. They give one final lecture about how Britain may continue to develop and may one day be a great country, but again, aside from the Boer War subplot at the beginning of the movie, it hasn't been touched on until the end here. If Cavalcade is about the dangers of British propaganda, why couldn't it have been about the widow of a soldier lashing back at society for glorifying war? Why couldn't it have been like All Quiet on the Western Front, where the characters are brought up their whole lives being told that war is going to kick ass, only to get a rude awakening once they actually go to war? I really hate to say this, but Cimarron did this kind of story much better than Cavalcade. Now, Cimarron isn't a good movie either, but you still see how the characters developed over the years, it establishes the setting of history well, and there is ultimately a point to it. It's a hypocritical point, but it still feels like it exists for a reason. Hell, there's no shortage of great movies that tie into historical events and have the bonus of not being terrible. Probably the best example to offset Cavalcade is a series of books that I grew up with called the Kent Family Chronicles. This is a series that documents a fictional family tree throughout the first 120 years of American history. This is the same sort of generational story, and starting with the third book, started becoming multi-generational. The first half of this book tells the story of one character, and then the second half completely changes gears to tell the story of his son. It spans about 30 years and has the characters interact with all sorts of major events, such as the Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812, and the destruction of the Federalist Party. But, despite being jam-packed with so much, it still has a point to it. That being a son going down the same path as his father without making the same mistakes. Cavalcade? I couldn't even tell you what the plot is. And it's ultimately such a bore. Not the Boers they fought a war against, but like, as in it's boring. It's dull. While I don't hate it as much as Cimarron, that's only because, like I said, it's just so nothing that you can't bring yourself to even have an emotion. Which, in some ways, that's even worse when you think about it, because that means it left absolutely no impact on you. So, yeah, I really don't like this one. But hey, credit where it's due. The transitions are pretty cool. Yeah, that's about the nicest thing I can say about it, but hey, they're cool transition scenes. This is one of those Oscar wins that I honestly struggle to wrap my head around. Even ignoring the movies that we'll be talking about in the next video, I'm genuinely curious as to why this would have been considered the best movie of the year. Even back then, it didn't break any new ground, it's not engaging, the characters are stock, and it ultimately feels really half-assed. I have looked high and low to find a positive review, a retrospective, old archives, letters from Academy members, anything to explain why this movie won. And everything I find are just reviews like this explaining why this movie didn't deserve to win. So, yeah, Cavalcade, it really, really, really sucks. Like, really bad. Seriously, you guys. So bad.
Bill, my friend? Yes, Ted, my friend. This has been a most excellent adventure.